The distress beacon had been burning for 11 hours when the hierarchy arrived. Cale Doran heard the sound before he understood it, a low, resonant hum that traveled not through the hull of the research vessel, but through the bones of his skull, through the fillings in his back teeth, through something deeper and less physical than either. He was in the archive bay when it began, cataloging the last of what they'd pulled from the derelict station at Coptos 7. 600 hours of untranslated signal data, 3 crystalline substrate samples, and one object that their lead physicist, Dr. Yara Mendes, had called the most complete unified information architecture she had ever seen. She'd said it like a person who had just opened a door they weren't sure they should have opened. She'd said it quietly, and then she hadn't said much else, because that was 8 hours ago and the hum had started 4 hours after that. Cale set down the substrate sample. The hum rose in pitch, and somewhere above him he heard the structural groaning that meant the ship's gravity compensators were fighting something they weren't designed to fight. He was Sergeant Tarchivist Cale Doran, seconded to the Linguistics Survey Corps out of Meridian Station, which meant he was the kind of soldier who cataloged things instead of shooting them, which had always struck him as a reasonable arrangement. He was 38 years old. He had a daughter named Sierra who was 9 and who lived with his sister on Meridian, and who had sent him a voice message 3 days ago in which she explained at length that she had decided her stuffed bear needed a rank, and that she was promoting him to admiral. Cale had listened to the message 4 times. He had not yet replied. He was thinking about that, about Admiral Bear and the message he hadn't sent, when the hierarchy ship dropped out of fold space alongside them. He saw it through the archive bay's small viewport. It was not a vessel in any architectural sense that a human engineer would recognize. It was more like a geometry had decided to become present, a shifting structure of tessellated plates and nested rings, each surface carrying engravings that Cale's trained eye recognized as high-order symbolic language, but that no human linguist had ever successfully parsed beyond the level of proscription and consequence. It was the size of a small moon. It made no sound. The hum had stopped the moment it appeared. Over the ship intercom, someone, he thought it was Navigator Petrov, said simply, "Oh." Then the boarding began. He did not watch them come aboard. He heard it, the wet tearing sound of a hull breach that was not a breach in any conventional sense, but rather a dissolution, as if the hierarchy had simply decided that the concept of wall did not apply to them, which, as best as anyone had been able to determine, it didn't. He heard shouting on the upper decks. He heard what he thought was Dr. Mendes' voice, high and sharp, and then he heard nothing, which was worse. Cale had spent 11 years studying the Amenvex hierarchy. He had cataloged their 17 known dialects, mapped their symbolic grammar across 400 recovered inscription sets, and written a doctoral thesis on the semantic structure of their proscription language, the dense, recursive notation they used to mark what was forbidden. He knew more about the hierarchy than perhaps any living human. What he knew, among other things, was that when a hierarchy purge vessel arrived somewhere, it was because someone had touched something they weren't supposed to touch. He looked at the crystalline object on the table beside him, the codex node. That was the name Dr. Mendes had given it, provisional, because it was the only designation that matched what the thing appeared to be, a complete, self-contained information architecture, written in a substrate that was not stone or metal or digital memory, but something that functioned like all 3 at once. A library compressed into a crystal the size of his fist. She had said it contained, to the best of her ability to read it, a unified theory of cognition, physics, consciousness, and stellar dynamics. Knowledge so comprehensive it would rewrite human understanding of the universe in every category simultaneously. He knew from his years of study what the hierarchy called such knowledge. They had a word for it. The word in their symbolic grammar was the same word they used for divine. He picked up the codex node and put it in his jacket pocket. The archive bay had an emergency escape pod. It was designed for one occupant. Cale had spent 4 minutes debating whether to use it, and had concluded that there was no version of this situation in which leaving the codex node on the ship produced a good outcome for the human species, and that there was perhaps a version in which leaving with it produced something, even if that something was only the chance that someone else later could carry it somewhere the hierarchy didn't follow. He reached the pod. He did not look back at the archive bay, at the 11 years of work, at the voice message on his terminal that he had still not answered. He launched. The pod's emergency trajectory took him into the hierarchy ship. He understood later that this was not an accident. The hierarchy's fold projection had already enclosed the research vessel within a bubble of controlled space. There was nowhere for his pod to go that was not already inside their architecture. He drifted for 6 hours in the sealed pod, watching through the forward lens as the research vessel was disassembled, not destroyed, disassembled piece by piece, with a methodical thoroughness that suggested inventory rather than violence. And then the pod was drawn in. The interior of the vault ship was cold. Not the cold of deep space, which was absolute and clean, but the cold of a place that had been designed by minds that did not experience temperature as a problem, and that had therefore never thought to regulate it for the benefit of anything that did. He was taken from the pod by a hierarchy custodian, one of the lower-tier entities, roughly bipedal, four-armed, with the pale, translucent exoskeleton of the servitor caste, and walked, not roughly but without any particular consideration, through corridors that were clearly designed for the display of inscription rather than the transit of bodies. Every surface was covered in symbolic text. Cale read it as he walked, habit overriding fear, and what he read made him press his hand against the codex node in his pocket to be sure it was still there. The hierarchy's internal notation, the deep grammar that governed their proscription law, was complex, but it was, at its core, built around a single axiom he had identified years ago, and which his colleagues had considered a reductive oversimplification until the evidence became impossible to ignore. The axiom was this: there existed a threshold of cognitive complexity above which all knowledge was classified as divine property. Below the threshold, thought was permitted to any creature. Above it, thought was the exclusive resource of the hierarchy's god caste, the Amenvex themselves. The hierarchy did not believe that humans had crossed this threshold. What they believed, what all their proscription language said, if you could read it, was that humans could not cross it. It was not that they were forbidden to. It was that, in the hierarchy's cosmology, such a crossing was simply impossible for a creature of human biological complexity. It would be like a stone deciding to photosynthesize. He was placed in a holding cell. The cell was metal, hexagonal, and very cold. There was one other occupant. She was sitting in the far corner with her knees drawn up to her chest and her feet bare against the frost-rimed floor. Cale's first assessment was, not human. His second assessment, following immediately, was young. His third assessment took longer and required him to actually look at her rather than at the initial catalog of differences. The heavier bone structure, the greenish-gray cast to her skin, the low brow and wide jaw and the small secondary pupils in her golden eyes, and what he concluded was cold. She was very, very cold, and she was not going to say so. She was one of the core. He recognized the physiognomy. The core were a warrior caste species who worked, in various configurations of coercion and contract, in service to a dozen different galactic powers, the hierarchy among them. They were not, by most diplomatic assessments, friends of humanity. They were not, by most diplomatic assessments, enemies of humanity either. They were a people who had been owned so many times that they had learned not to have opinions about their owners. She watched him with the patient, exhausted wariness of someone who had long since stopped expecting anything good to happen and had made a certain kind of peace with it. Cale looked at her feet on the frost-covered floor. He looked at his own thermal underlayer, which he was wearing beneath his jacket. He looked at the cold. He sat down on the floor, pulled off his jacket, and began tearing strips from the thermal underlayer. She watched him do this without moving. "I'm going to wrap your feet," he said. He said it in Core dialect, which he spoke moderately well, because he was a linguist and because he had met Core traders at Meridian Station, and because he believed, professionally and personally, that speaking to someone in their language was the minimum requirement of treating them as a person. "If you'd rather I didn't, tell me and I'll stop." She said nothing for a long moment. Her eyes dropped to the strips of thermal fabric in his hands, and then back to his face, and he could see her trying to parse what he was doing against a model of human behavior that clearly did not have a category for it. "Why?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was more like she was running a diagnostic. "Because the floor is cold, and you have no boots. You lose heat too." "I have boots," he said. She looked at his boots. She looked at the thermal strips. She unfolded her legs slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision they aren't entirely sure of, and extended her feet toward him. Her name was Vreth. He learned this over the next several hours, slowly, in the way that two people learn each other's names when they share a cell in a place neither of them chose. She was young, younger than he'd initially estimated, somewhere in the core equivalent of late adolescence, which the core did not mark with any particular ceremony because the core had learned, over centuries of displacement, not to mark things that could be taken away. She had been a soldier in a core detachment assigned to hierarchy patrol duty. She had been imprisoned because she had asked a question. "What question?" Cale asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I asked why the inscriptions in the lower corridors were sealed, the ones below the secondary archive vault." Cale felt the codex note in his pocket and said nothing. "The custodian told my commander. My commander said I had demonstrated a tendency toward prohibited inquiry." She said this without particular emotion, which, Cale suspected, took considerable effort. The hierarchy considers prohibited inquiry in servitor species to be a structural defect. "A defect," he repeated. "Like a fault in metal, something to be corrected or discarded." He thought about that for a while. He thought about Dr. Mendes, who had opened the door that shouldn't be opened, who had looked at the codex node and said, quietly, with the voice of someone genuinely moved, "Do you understand what this is? Do you understand that this is everything?" He thought about Yara Mendes and whether she had been corrected or discarded. "The inscriptions below the secondary archive vault," he said. "Did you read any of them before they caught you?" Vreth looked at him with the measuring expression he was beginning to recognize. "Some," she said. "What did they say?" She was quiet for a long time. "They described a place," she finally said, "between the archives and the processing cores. The hierarchy call it the threshold realm. It is where they store the minds of those who are being processed." She paused. "Not killed, transferred. The hierarchy take the cognitive patterns of the entities they capture and store them in the deep archive, particularly those with knowledge they want to examine." Cale's hand went to his pocket without thinking about it. The codex node was warm against his palm, warmer than the air around it. "Could you find it?" he asked. "The threshold realm." She looked at him for a long time. He watched her make a calculation. He had the sense of watching someone who had spent a long time making calculations about what was safe and what was not, and who was now factoring in a variable they hadn't expected. "You have the object," she said, "not a question." "Yes." "They will kill you for it." "They'll try to process me," he said, "which is different, I think." She looked at him, at his thermal strips wound around her feet, at his jacket now lost to her use, at the codex node-shaped pressure in his pocket. She looked at all of this, and he could see her trying to understand why he had done the thing with the thermal strips, the thing that did not fit any category she had for human behavior, the thing that had cost him something small for no obvious return. I can find it, she said. The threshold realm was not a place in the architectural sense. It was more that there were corridors in the vault ship that, if you walked them in a specific sequence that Vreth knew and Kale memorized, brought you to a set of sealed plates that responded, they discovered, after 2 failures and 1 very tense retreat from a passing custodian, to a combination of Vreth's biosignature and Kale's ability to vocalize the correct sonic symbolic sequence in hierarchy formal register. You can actually speak their deep language, Vreth said, when the plates dissolved. Read it mostly. Speaking it is harder, but the phonemic range is technically within human vocal capacity if you've trained for it. He paused. I've trained for it. She made a sound that, in core dialect, he recognized as the vocalization used for things that were unexpected but not unwelcome. He decided to take it as a compliment. Beyond the plates was cold and dark, and then, suddenly, not cold and not dark. A space that was defined less by physical boundaries than by light, a diffuse blue-white radiance that came from every direction and none, and within that light, suspended like sediment in still water, were minds. He understood them to be minds because they spoke. Not in sound, the communication was more direct than sound, more like meaning arriving fully formed in the part of the brain that processed meaning, bypassing the auditory cortex entirely. And what they said, or rather what they were, was information, the accumulated cognitive patterns of everything the hierarchy had ever decided to examine rather than simply destroy. Xenoarchaeologists, linguists, scientists, soldiers who had asked questions, a whole sediment layer of sapient curiosity preserved in the cold light of the hierarchy's archive. One of them spoke to him directly. She said, I waited 11 years. And Kale recognized her voice, because he had listened to it for 11 years, in lectures and in arguments over methodology, and in quiet moments in the archive bay when the work was going well, and the coffee was good, and she would sometimes read aloud from her notes just to hear how they sounded. Dr. Yara Mendes, not dead, processed. Stored in the hierarchy's deep archive, because she had held the codex node in her hands, and her cognitive patterns had done what human cognitive patterns did when confronted with genuine unified theory. They had reorganized, rapidly and irreversibly, into something the hierarchy's monitoring systems had flagged. I tried to encode a message in the derelict station's signal data, she said. 11 years ago, someone must have heard it. We heard it, he said, 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. She processed this with a strange calm. I've been here for what feels like considerably longer. Time functions differently in the archive. Can you get out? The question moved through the light like a stone through water, rippling. There are rules, said another voice, older, colder, archival in its cadence, as if it had been here long enough to become part of the place. The voice of a mind that had spent a very long time with nothing to do but understand the rules. There are always rules. The hierarchy are very fond of rules. It is perhaps the only thing they share with humans. He turned toward the voice. In the diffuse light, there was something, a concentration, a density of presence that was more structured than the others, more deliberately shaped. A mind that had been here long enough to learn how to be a mind in this place. The entity introduced itself as Nofer. It had been a hierarchy philosopher caste individual who had questioned the divine knowledge axiom 70 years ago and had been neither killed nor fully processed, left in a kind of intermediate state, not dead but not alive in any hierarchy-recognized sense. It knew the architecture of the threshold realm the way a long-term prisoner knows a cell, not with pleasure, but with the completeness that comes from having nowhere else to look. The codex node Nofer said, You have it. Yes. They will send the 3 to reclaim it. They always send the 3. The hierarchy godcast has always used 3 aspects when dealing with what they consider transgression against divine property. Amenhek, the sovereign, Thoth Var, the archivist, and Isiskel, the shaper. Cale had read about the three in the symbolic grammar. He had written a footnote about them in his doctoral thesis. He wished, briefly, that past Cale had known that future Cale would regret keeping it to a footnote. What will they do? Each will make an attempt to reclaim the codex node, said Nofer. Not by force. Force is for the servitor castes. The three use law, knowledge, and desire. The sovereign will invoke proscription. The archivist will challenge your right to comprehend what you carry. The shaper will offer you something you want more than you want the truth. What do I do? You survive them, said Nofer, and then you make them negotiate. Make the hierarchy negotiate. Vreth had been listening from the edge of the light, and her voice carried exactly the tone that statement deserved. They have rules, said Nofer, and rules can be turned. That is the one thing every prisoner eventually learns, and the one thing the hierarchy has never understood about the species they collect. Amenhek came first. It arrived in the holding cell 3 hours after their return from the Threshold realm, not dramatically, not with the physical manifestation of power that Cale had expected from a god-cast entity, but quietly, as a change in the quality of the air. A stillness that was not stillness but command, the sense that the space had been reorganized around a new center of gravity. It was tall. It was also, in the way of the hierarchy's highest caste, not entirely present in any single spatial location. Part of its mass occupied the cell and part occupied something adjacent to the cell that was not, strictly, space as Cale understood it. It looked at him the way a person looks at an item they have misplaced and found under the couch. Not hostile exactly, but irritated at the interruption of order. It spoke in hierarchy formal register, which Cale understood, and it said what Nofer had said it would say. He had taken an object that was classified as divine property under hierarchy proscription law, which law he had tacitly agreed to by operating in hierarchy-patrolled space, and he was therefore in violation of the covenant of cognitive boundaries, and the object must be returned, and this was not a negotiation. Cale said, I wasn't operating in hierarchy-patrolled space. We were in the Coptos system. The Coptos system is in human survey territory under the Second Galactic Concordat. The Amenhek was silent for a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment. The Concordat exemption does not apply to objects of divine classification, it said. The Concordat exemption applies to all objects discovered within the survey boundaries, Cale said. The codex node was discovered within the survey boundaries. I can show you the discovery logs. I have them in my archive vest. Would you like me to? The proscription language on the surrounding walls brightened, subtly, in the way that lights brighten when more power is rooted to them. The object was not discovered. It was recognized. The Concordat distinction applies to new materials, not to classified divine property that had been displaced from hierarchy inventory. If it was hierarchy inventory, Cale said, then I'd expect to find a hierarchy inventory marker on it. Would you like to examine the object for an inventory marker? I'd be happy to. The Amenhek left. This was not, Cale understood, a victory. It was a deferral. He had found a procedural seam and pulled at it, and the Amenhek had withdrawn to consult the applicable law, which meant it would return with a better argument. But the seam had been there. The seam had been real. Vreth, who had watched this exchange from the corner with her wrapped feet tucked under her and her arms around her knees, said, You argued procedure with an Amenvek's god. I argued that their proscription didn't apply. You argued procedure with an Amenvek's god, she said again, with slightly different emphasis. He sat down on the floor next to her. His heart was doing something complicated in his chest that he was choosing to interpret as useful adrenaline rather than terror. Did it work? It left, she said. Things that are not working don't usually leave. He thought about that. He took the codex node out of his pocket and held it in his palm, feeling its warmth, the slight vibration that might have been information or might have been his own nervous system's response to holding something that apparently constituted divine property. He thought about Dr. Mendy's voice in the threshold realm. He thought about the message from Sira that he still had not answered. "How are your feet?" he asked. Vreth looked down at the thermal wrapping. She flexed her toes inside it. "Warmer," she said, with the careful precision of someone who has decided that precision is safer than gratitude, but who is not without gratitude. Thothvar came next. It did not arrive in the cell. It arrived in the threshold realm, where Kale had returned with Vreth, partly because Nofer had indicated the three would make their challenges in succession, and partly because Dr. Mendes was there, and because he found that he was not willing to leave her alone again. Thothvar was the archivist caste, and it looked like an archivist, smaller than the Amenhek, precise in its movements, its exoskeletal surface covered not in the sweeping inscription plates of the god caste, but in close, dense notation, a living index, a being that had become, over its existence, largely indistinguishable from the information it managed. It regarded Kale with what he could only describe as professional assessment. It said, the Codex node contained knowledge that operated at the third tier of the divine complexity scale. It said, human neurological architecture was documented as incapable of processing third-tier complexity without catastrophic cognitive dissolution. It said, his possession of the Codex node was therefore not merely a legal violation but a physical impossibility. He could not comprehend what he carried, which meant he was, in the legal philosophical sense, not carrying it. He was at best a transport medium for an object that would, if engaged, destroy him. Therefore he could not be in violation, because violation required intent, and intent required comprehension, and comprehension was beyond him. He listened to this carefully. He noted that Thothvar, in making this argument, had handed him something. "I'd like to respond to that," he said. Thothvar waited with the patience of something that had processed several thousand years of argument, and was not particularly impressed by any of it. "You're saying I can't understand the Codex node," Kale said. "But you're arguing that in response to me demonstrating a sufficiently complete understanding of your legal code, in your formal register, to successfully engage the archive access sequence and enter the threshold realm. A sequence which, and I'd like you to check your records here, has never been successfully navigated by a non-hierarchy entity in the entire operational history of this vault ship." The light in the threshold realm shifted slightly. Around them, the suspended minds were very still. "I'm not claiming I understand the Codex node completely," he continued. "I'm claiming that the human species' cognitive architecture is not what your models say it is, and I have standing evidence to suggest that your models were last updated when, because the Concordat was signed on the basis of those models, and if the models are wrong. You are arguing that human cognitive capacity exceeds documented parameters," said Thothvar. "I'm arguing that your documentation is out of date. I'm a linguist. I know what happens to systems that rely on old data." He paused. "I'm happy to submit to a cognitive assessment right now. I think you'll find the results interesting." He felt Dr. Mendy's presence in the surrounding light, and through that presence, something that was not quite laughter and not quite grief, but was very much the specific emotion of watching a student prove that they were ready. Thothvar withdrew to assess the cognitive assessment parameters. It also came back, but it came back 4 hours later, and when it did, its notation surface was displaying what Kale recognized as the hierarchy's equivalent of a flagged anomaly, and it was significantly less certain than it had been. The assessment results were not consistent with baseline human parameters, it said. "No," Kale agreed, "they're not." It left again. Vreth from behind him said, "What did it mean?" "It means humans have changed since they last checked. We do that. It's one of our less endearing qualities depending on your perspective." He paused. "It means the Shaper is next." Isiskel came in the shape of his daughter. He understood this, intellectually, almost immediately. Understood that the Shaper's mechanism was desire, and that it had read him well enough to know what shape desire took for Cale Doran at this moment, in this place, in this specific inventory of his life. Understanding this did not make it easier. Sira was 9 years old. She was standing in the threshold realm's diffused light, looking exactly as she had looked in the last image he had of her. Dark hair in 2 slightly uneven braids, a gap where her top left incisor had been. The expression she wore when she was being patient with him that was so precisely like her mother's expression that it still, 2 years after the divorce, caught him somewhere between the ribs. She said, "Dad." He stopped. He stopped and he stood there and he looked at his daughter, who was not his daughter, and he felt the specific, acute desolation of a person who has been found at the exact point where their defenses have no thickness. She said, "Come home. I want you to come home. You've been here long enough. You can put it down. You can put the thing down and come home, and I want to show you what Admiral Bear has been doing." His hand went to his pocket. The codex node was warm and solid, the warmth of something that contained everything humanity had spent 100,000 years of cognitive evolution becoming capable of understanding. The warmth of a door. He thought, "She's right that I can put it down." He thought, "The choice has always been this simple in one direction. Give it back and live. Give it back and go home. Give it back and hear the voice message and finally answer it." He stood there for 30 seconds that lasted approximately a century. Then Vreth stepped up beside him. She did not touch him. She stood close enough that he could feel the warmth of her beside him in the cold of the archive light, and she said quietly in core dialect, "That is not her." He knew that. He had known it from the first instant. "That is not her," Vreth said again, "and you know what she would actually say. Children who are actually yours do not say what you most want to hear. They say what you least expect." He thought about the voice message. He thought about Admiral Bear receiving a promotion. He thought about Sira, actual Sira, who had once spent 20 minutes explaining to him why octopuses would be better at interstellar diplomacy than humans, because they have more arms and could shake hands with more aliens at the same time, and who had concluded this argument with the observation that he should probably stop working so much and think about things like this more often. He said to the shape of his daughter, "Tell me what Admiral Bear is up to." The shape was silent for exactly the duration it needed to retrieve a plausible answer, and that duration was a half-second too long, and that was enough. "I know you're not her," he said. "I know because if you were her, you would already have told me about Admiral Bear without being asked, because that is the only thing she wanted to talk about last time we spoke. So," he took his hand out of his pocket empty, "tell Isiskel to come speak to me herself. I'll wait." The shape of Sira dissolved. What replaced it was difficult to describe. Something vast and graceful and entirely without warmth, shaped vaguely around the concept of a feminine form, but scaled to the architecture of the archive rather than to human space. It looked at him with the expression, if such a term could apply, of something that was very old and had been very rarely surprised, and was currently occupying the latter category. "You refuse the Shaper," it said. "No salvageable entity has refused the Shaper." "I had good data," he said. "She would have told me about Admiral Bear immediately. The delay was the tell." The Isiskel was quiet for an interval that felt like the archive, processing a very large input. Then it said, "What do you want?" And Cale said, "I want to negotiate." The negotiation happened in the threshold realm, which was, Cale suspected, a significant procedural concession. The fact that the three agreed to it at all suggested that the combination of Amenhotep's procedural block, Thothvar's cognitive assessment anomaly, and his refusal of the Shaper had collectively pushed the hierarchy into a position it genuinely did not have established protocol for. The hierarchy had a law. The law said, Knowledge of divine complexity may only be paid for in death. It was the law that had governed their accumulation of the archive for 3,000 years. It was, Nofer explained, the reason the hierarchy had never needed to negotiate before. Every entity that had ever claimed divine classification knowledge had eventually been presented with that law, and the law had always been adequate. What the law assumed was that the claiming entity had not yet paid. Kale stood in the light of the threshold realm, with Vreth beside him and Nofer behind him and Dr. Mendes, and 100 other stored minds quiet in the archive around him. And he made an argument he had been constructing for 3 days since the moment he first understood what the Codex Node was. The law says that knowledge of divine complexity must be paid for in death, he said. I am prepared to demonstrate that the human species has already paid. The three were present in the archive as concentrations of density in the light. He addressed them all. Humanity has spent its entire cognitive history doing exactly what the hierarchy has classified as prohibited inquiry. We've questioned everything we've encountered. We've taken knowledge we were told belonged to others, to gods, to kings, to institutions, to species more powerful than us. We have been destroyed for it repeatedly, at every scale from the individual to the civilization, and we have kept doing it anyway. We have paid for knowledge with fire and plague and war and the deaths of everyone who came before us, and built the cognitive architecture that allowed us to stand here today and read your language back to you. He paused. The Codex Node doesn't represent a new debt. It represents a bill that our entire history has already settled. Silence in the archive. Then, the hierarchy law does not recognize historical payment, said the Amenhek. It recognizes individual transaction. Then let me offer you an individual transaction, Kale said, right now. Something moved at the edge of the light, a disturbance, a presence that he had not expected, and which arrived with a weight that immediately reorganized his understanding of what was possible in this moment. He turned. His daughter was there. Not the shape of his daughter. His daughter, Sira Doran, 9 years old, stored in the hierarchy's archive. The voice message he hadn't answered now answered in the worst possible way. The cognitive pattern of a child who had asked, somewhere, at some point during the days of chaos after the research vessel was destroyed, one too many questions about where her father had gone. The hierarchy, it appeared, had cast a very wide net. She looked at him with her actual face, the asymmetrical braids, the gap in her teeth, and she said, with actual Sira's actual precision, "Hi, Dad. I've been here for 3 days. It's weird. There's a lot of light." He did not move for a long time. She said, "I know what you're trying to do. Nofer explained it to me." "I want to help," he said, with a voice that was doing things he was not entirely in control of. "You don't need to." "The law says someone has to pay," she said. "I'll pay." He started to speak. "Listen," she said, and she said it in the tone that was not her mother's tone or his tone, but was purely hers, the tone of someone who has thought about something carefully and has arrived at a conclusion and would like the adults to stop interrupting. "I know the law. I've been here for 3 days and I've read most of the archive because there isn't anything else to do. The law says divine knowledge can only be paid for in death. I'm already here. I'm already in the archive. If I offer to stay, to be payment, to let the archive keep my pattern permanently, then the debt is settled, right?" She looked at the concentrations of light that were the three. "Isn't that how it works?" The archive was very still. Kale said, "Sira, no." "Dad," she said, "I figured out why octopuses would be better at interstellar diplomacy. I figured out a lot of other things too here. I've had time." She looked at the three. "I offer myself as payment, permanent archive. In exchange, my father goes free, Dr. Mendes goes free, all stored human minds are released, and my father keeps the Codex Node. Do we have an agreement?" The three were silent for a duration that Kale could not have measured, inside which he felt the Codex Node in his pocket and thought about every choice that had led to this moment. Every moment he had cataloged something instead of going home, every message he had not answered, and the particular weight of watching a 9-year-old outmaneuver 3 entities that had governed a star empire for 3,000 years. And then from the archive around them, a sound or not a sound, a change in the quality of the light, a resonance through the stored minds, something that had not happened in 3,000 years of the hierarchy's operation. Nofer said, "They cannot accept." Kale said, "Why not?" "Because the law requires that payment be made in ignorance. The one who pays must not know what they are paying for. The willingness negates the transaction. The hierarchy law was written to punish curiosity, and your daughter is offering herself from curiosity, with full knowledge, which is not punishment at all. It is continuation." The 3 were very still. "That is correct," said Thothvar, with something in its notation surface that Kale recognized after a moment as the hierarchy's symbolic marker for precedent-breaking event. "The law cannot be applied here," said the Amenhek. "There is no applicable protocol." "What there is," said Isiskel, and Kale felt, in the way the archive light shifted, something that was very close to the hierarchy's version of reluctant acknowledgement, is a situation for which the law was not written. Because the law assumed that the knowledge would silence the knowing, and it has not. He looked at Sira. She looked back at him with the expression that was purely and entirely hers, the expression of someone who has been patient and done their homework, and would like everyone to acknowledge that she was right about the octopuses. He said very quietly, "Hi, kid." "Hi, Dad," she said. "Did you answer my message?" "I'm going to," he said. "Right now, I'm going to answer it right now." They negotiated for 4 hours. The final terms were not everything Kale had hoped for and considerably more than he had expected. The Codex node was classified as a joint claim object under a new provision of the Concordat, pending cognitive assessment of human species development, meaning the hierarchy could not confiscate it, but Kale could not disseminate it without a bilateral review process that would take, by the hierarchy's own estimates, between 20 and 200 years to complete. Dr. Mendes was released from the archive, along with 11 other human cognitive patterns and 42 non-human ones, including, at Vreth's quiet insistence, 3 core philosophers who had been stored for asking questions that were now, under the new provision, arguably not violations at all. Nofer was not released. Nofer had been in the archive for 70 years and had become, in the process, more archive than individual, and was not certain that outside the archive constituted a meaningful category for whatever it had become. But Nofer negotiated its own provision, a seat at the bilateral review, an advisory function, something that was, as Nofer observed with what Kale was almost certain was dry humor, rather better than its previous function. Vreth received a formal release from hierarchy service, documented in the hierarchy's own legal notation, in Kale's handwriting, because Kale was the only non-hierarchy entity who could write in the hierarchy's legal notation, and countersigned by the Amenhek under the new precedent. She stood in the holding cell afterward and held the document, and looked at it with the expression of someone who has not previously held something that said, in legally binding terms, that they belonged to themselves. "What will you do?" Kale asked. She thought about it. She folded the document carefully and tucked it inside her uniform jacket. She looked at the thermal strips still wound around her feet. They had held, he noted, for the duration of everything that had followed. "I have been a soldier for others for my entire life," she said. "I think I would like to ask some questions of my own for a while." "That seems reasonable," he said. "The hierarchy," she said, with the careful precision she used when approaching something that mattered, "do not understand why you wrapped my feet." "No. I have been trying to understand it myself." She paused. "You did not know me. You had nothing to gain from it. It cost you something small, but something." "It was cold," he said, "and you had no boots." She was quiet for a moment, Yes, she finally said. But you are the only one who thought that was a sufficient reason. He thought about that all the way out of the vault ship, with the codex note in his pocket and Sierra's hand in his and Dr. Mindy's walking slightly ahead of them, and already, characteristically, talking about what she wanted to do with the bilateral review process, and what they were going to need in terms of a research team, and where on earth she was going to find enough linguists, and Cale listening to her with one ear, and to the vault ship's receding hum with the other, and thinking that if he had to name the thing that had changed everything, that had turned a purge mission into a negotiation, a violation into a precedent, an ending into something considerably stranger and more interesting than an ending. It would not be the codex note in his pocket. It would not be his knowledge of the hierarchy's formal register. It would not even be Sierra's careful, devastating invocation of a law the hierarchy had not written carefully enough. It would be the thermal strips on a core girl's feet, in a cold room, in a ship neither of them had chosen to be on. The thing that had cost him something small for no obvious return, and which had given him, in exchange, a guide through the threshold realm and a partner who knew when the delay between a question and an answer was a half-second too long. He thought that is how it always works. He thought the small human gesture that the alien cannot compute is never the thing you plan. It is the thing you do because the floor is cold and someone has no boots, and because you are, underneath everything, a person who thinks that is a sufficient reason. He took his compad out of his jacket and opened the unanswered message. He listened to it. Sierra's voice, explaining Admiral Bear's promotion, explaining the reasoning behind it in full 9-year-old diplomatic detail. He hit reply. He said, "Admiral Bear sounds like an excellent choice. Tell me everything. I'm coming home." The vault ship receded behind them into the dark between stars, its inscriptions burning with the slow cold light of everything it was still trying to protect. Cale Doran held his daughter's hand and walked away from it, carrying knowledge that neither he nor the hierarchy had any longer the luxury of pretending was divine. It was only everything. It was only everything humans had ever died to become capable of understanding. He thought, we already paid for this. He thought, we've been paying for 10,000 years. He thought, it's ours. Outside the vault ship, in the transition shuttle that the hierarchy provided as part of the negotiated terms, a small, cold, functional craft, clearly designed to get rid of them efficiently rather than comfortably. Dr. Mindy's was already 3 pages into a notebook she had borrowed from Vreth's uniform pocket, and was writing so fast that Cale occasionally caught individual phrases passing by. Bilateral cognition threshold, species reclassification precedent, Nofer's advisory function needs formal title. "You're writing it all down now," he said. "I am always writing things down," said Dr. Mindy's without looking up. "That is what got me here." "Fair," he said. Sierra had fallen asleep against his shoulder, which happened so suddenly and so completely that she had clearly been running on pure adrenaline and stubbornness since the moment she'd arrived in the archive, and had simply run out. He sat very still and let her sleep and watched the vault ship recede through the shuttle's forward viewport. Vreth sat across from him. She had found a pair of basic thermal socks somewhere in the shuttle's emergency kit, not boots, but something, and she was wearing them over the strips he'd wound around her feet, which she had not removed. He noted this without mentioning it. "The bilateral review," she said after a while. "They said it would take between 20 and 200 years. That's the estimate, yes. That's a very wide range. The hierarchy are very precise about things they've done before and very imprecise about things they haven't," Cale said. "This is something they haven't done before." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the vault ship's inscriptions were still visible as a faint cold glow in the dark, a receding constellation of forbidden text. She watched it until it was not visible anymore, and then she continued to watch the space where it had been. In my culture, she said, when someone saves your life, there is a specific word for the relationship that creates. The word means, approximately, person to whom I owe the continuance of existing. He was about to say something about how he hadn't exactly saved her life, and that in any reasonable accounting she had saved his considerably more than once, and that the thermal strips had been a small thing, a nothing really. When she held up one hand, the core gesture, he knew, for I am not finished. I am aware, she said, that you will argue this was a small thing. I am aware you will say it was simply because the floor was cold. I have been thinking about this for the entire duration of our time in the vault ship, and I have concluded that this is precisely the point. He waited. The hierarchy understand large gestures, Vreth said. They understand sacrifice and debt and transaction. What they do not understand, what their entire cognitive architecture is not equipped to process, is the thing you did, which was a small thing for no reason at a small cost with no expectation of return. That is not something they have a law for. That is not something they have a category for. She paused. That is the thing that opened the door, not the legal argument, not the cognitive assessment, not even your daughter. She looked at him steadily. The door opened because you sat down on a cold floor and wrapped someone's feet who you had no reason to care about, and you did it because it needed to be done. Dr. Mendes, still writing, said without looking up, "She's right, you know. I've been trying to figure out the inflection point, and that's it." The Amenhec's first withdrawal wasn't the procedural argument. It was the procedural argument combined with the fact that their biosurveillance had already flagged the thermal strip incident as an anomalous behavior that didn't fit any predicted human response matrix. Cale looked at her. "You knew about the biosurveillance." "I've been in their archive for 11 years, said Dr. Mendes. "I've had time to learn a few things." She turned a page. "Including that the hierarchy's models of humanity were based on behavioral data from first contact incidents that are all, every single one of them, conflict scenarios. They have never once observed humans in non-crisis interaction. Everything they know about us was learned from watching us fight." He thought about that. "They have no data on this," he said slowly. "None. A human willingly ceding personal resources to a non-allied species member in a zero-sum environment with no social enforcement mechanism. Their models output that as impossible." She looked up at him for the first time, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who had spent 11 years with nothing to do but think, and who had arrived at a conclusion they found both terrible and wonderful. "We broke their model with a pair of socks, Cale. That's the story. That's the whole story." He looked at Vreth. She looked back at him with those double-pupiled golden eyes, and she was, for the first time since he'd met her, allowing herself to look like she found something slightly funny. "To be precise," she said, "it was not socks. It was strips torn from a thermal underlayer. There is a difference." "There is a difference," he agreed. "But yes," she said, "approximately that." Sierra stirred against his shoulder, but did not wake. Outside, the stars were ordinary stars. The hierarchy's vault ship lost now in the dark behind them. Ahead somewhere the long way home and the bilateral review process, and 20 to 200 years of teaching an ancient star empire that humanity was something other than what they'd measured, and all the work that implied, and all the work that had always implied. And the codex node warm in his pocket, containing everything the universe was, and everything that could be known about it, and everything humanity had been building toward for 10,000 years of asking questions out loud in the dark. He thought, that is what we are. He thought, we are the species that will tear up our own thermal underlayer for a stranger on a cold floor, because the floor is cold, and they need it more. He thought, the hierarchy have spent 3,000 years protecting knowledge from us, because they thought we would misuse it. He thought they were wrong, and they were wrong in the most specific possible way. They thought we would take it. We were never going to take it. We were going to share it. That was the thing the inscriptions never said. That was the thing no proscription language in the universe could prohibit, because it was not a transaction and it was not a theft, and it had no name in any system built around the concept of divine property, the gesture that cost something small and expected nothing back, the thing that was not law and not power and not survival instinct, the thing that was just human. Just the irreducible, inexplicable, difficult-to-model human habit of seeing a cold floor and bare feet and thinking, that can be fixed. Let me fix that. He closed his eyes. He thought about Admiral Bear. He thought, I'm going to hear about that promotion in person, and it's going to take at least an hour, and I'm going to listen to every word of it. He thought, that is what's waiting on the other side of 20 to 200 years of changing a 3,000-year-old empire's mind about what humanity is. He thought, we've done harder things. The shuttle moved through the dark between stars, small and warm and heading home, carrying knowledge that belonged to everyone who had ever paid for it, which was everyone, which was the whole of the long human argument with the universe. The argument that had never ended and never would, the argument that was not a theft and not a war but was, at its most essential, just a question asked out loud in the cold. Why is this sealed? Who decided? And may I look? 3 weeks later, back on Meridian Station, Kale sat in a briefing room with the Joint Species Liaison Council and tried to explain what had happened. The council consisted of 7 humans and 4 non-human representatives from species allied with humanity under the Second Galactic Concordat, and they had been listening for 2 hours, and the expression on their faces collectively was the expression of people who were trying to decide whether what they were hearing was the best possible news in the history of the species, or a catastrophic diplomatic incident that would require several decades of careful management. And the answer was, of course, both. Let me understand the timeline, said Director Akoy, the head of the Linguistic Survey Corps and the person who had signed Kale's secondment papers 11 years ago. She was a small, precise woman who had the manner of someone who had spent a career hearing unexpected things and had developed excellent shock absorption. You retrieved a hierarchy-classified divine property object, were captured aboard a hierarchy vault ship, negotiated access to their deep archive, survived 3 challenge aspects of the Amonvex Godcast, and ultimately compelled the hierarchy to recognize a new bilateral concordat provision by invoking a logical contradiction in their own proscription law. That's broadly correct, Kale said. And the mechanism by which you initially established a cooperative relationship with the core prisoner, the relationship that gave you access to the threshold realm and made all subsequent events possible, was. I wrapped her feet, he said. Director Akoy looked at him. The floor was cold, he said. She had no boots. The silence in the briefing room lasted for a count of approximately 7 seconds, which in diplomatic briefing rooms was an extremely long silence. Then the Corps representative, a senior attaché named Dresch, who had been present at the Concordat negotiations and who had, Kale noticed, been extremely still and attentive for the entire 2 hours of his briefing, leaned forward and said in Corps dialect, which Kale understood perfectly and which Director Akoy did not. There is a word in our language for a human like you. We do not use it often. We have not had cause to. What word? Kale asked. Dresch told him. The word was long and compound and meant, as best Kale could translate it, one who sees the floor is cold before they see the species. He thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about Vreth, who was somewhere now, asking her own questions. She had declined the offer of a transit passage to any core-settled world, and had instead accepted a provisional research associate position with the Meridian Linguistic Survey Corps, on the grounds that she wanted to learn formally how to read hierarchy symbolic grammar, which was a reasonable goal and which Kale suspected was not entirely unconnected to a certain deep archive philosopher named Nofer, who was going to need a lot of correspondence over the next 20 to 200 years. He thought about Dr. Mendes, who had already submitted 3 papers based on her 11 years of archival study, and who had told Kale, over the first coffee either of them had consumed in what felt like a geological epoch, that the Codex Node's bilateral review process was going to require the largest linguistics team ever assembled, and that she needed Kale on it, and that she needed him to understand that this was not optional, which he did understand, and which he accepted. He thought about Sira. She was at home with his sister doing the things that 9-year-olds did. She had, in their first evening back together, spent 40 minutes explaining Admiral Bear's expanded command structure, which now apparently encompassed a small fleet of stuffed animals organized by the strategic logic of a 9-year-old who had spent 3 days in an alien archive reading hierarchy military doctrine and had found it, in her words, too complicated and also mean. He had listened to every word of it. He had asked follow-up questions. He had taken it extremely seriously, which was easy because she was serious, and because the strategic logic of a 9-year-old who had outmaneuvered an Amonvex god deserved to be taken seriously on its own terms. He thought she is going to be something extraordinary. He thought she already is. He thought this is what we're protecting, not the Codex Node, not the bilateral review, not the slow work of changing a 3,000-year-old empire's mind about what we are. This, right here, a kid promoting a stuffed bear and being absolutely correct about the geometry of the chain of command. This is what it was all for. This is what it's always for. He took out the Codex Node and set it on the table in front of Director Akoy. It pulsed once, gently, in the warm light of the briefing room, a pale blue-white like compressed starlight, like a door that was already open. "Here's where we start," he said,